A clock strikes, but at the wrong hour. Welcome to Fabled Codex. I am your host, Mithrin. Tell me where you're listening from in the comments. I love seeing this community grow. Your voices make this journey special. Let's begin. It was one of those golden afternoons in late summer when even the roses seemed reluctant to fade. The village of St. Aldith's, tucked away behind its ivy-covered cottages and winding lanes, bustled with a quiet cheer. On the vicarage lawn, tables had been laid with lace cloths and china teacups, each carefully polished until they gleamed in the sun. The annual garden party, hosted by Reverend and Mrs. Howard, was the highlight of the season, an occasion where everyone, from the humblest maid to the most distinguished landowner, gathered under the same striped marquee for cakes, raffles, and conversation. Miss Marple, dressed in a pale blue summer frock, sat in her accustomed place by the rose arch. She had a plate of seed cake on her lap and an expression of mild interest upon her face. To anyone watching, she seemed merely another elderly lady enjoying the afternoon. Yet her eyes, blue, shrewd, and deceptively gentle, missed little. She noted the nervous twitch of Mrs. Ellison's hand as she poured tea, the deliberate avoidance of eye contact between young Clara Barnes and Mr. Edmund Prowse, and the way old Mr. Trent checked his watch far too often, as though waiting for something that troubled him. At precisely 4 o'clock, the parish clock tolled, its heavy chimes echoing across the village green. But instead of the measured count of 4, the bell struck 6. A ripple of confusion passed through the guests. A few laughed, shrugging it off as some quaint mechanical mishap. "It seems even the clock's eager for supper," joked Mr. Prowse, though his laugh was strained. Moments later, a sharp cry pierced the air. Heads turned toward the narrow path leading from the orchard. There, stumbling into the open, was young Clara Barnes, her summer dress torn, her face white as chalk. She pointed a trembling hand toward the orchard. He's lying there," she stammered, her voice breaking. "Mr. Trent, he's dead." A sudden hush fell upon the gathering. Teacups were set down, chairs scraped back, and in that dreadful pause before action, Miss Marple rose slowly to her feet. Her expression remained calm, but behind her composed exterior, her thoughts moved swiftly, methodically, and with the certainty of one who knew that evil, even in the most peaceful of places, often lurked just beneath the roses and teacups. Would you like me to continue with Chapter 2, The Village Reacts, where gossip and speculation ripple through St. Aldith's, or would you prefer me to expand Chapter 1 with more character introductions and subtle foreshadowing before we move into the aftermath of the murder? The silence that followed Clara's announcement seemed to stretch unnaturally, as though the very air had thickened. For a moment no one moved, and the bright sounds of the garden party, the clinking of teaspoons, the rustle of skirts, the chatter of polite voices, died away, replaced by the distant caw of a rook circling above the churchyard. Then came the murmur, a ripple of disbelief spreading swiftly through the gathered company, like wind stirring long grass. "Mr. Trent, dead?" cried Mrs. Howard, her hand clutching at her pearls as if to steady herself. Surely not. Surely some dreadful mistake. But Clara, pale and near fainting, shook her head with wild insistence. "I saw him. I touched him. He isn't breathing. He's quite cold." Her voice broke on the last word, and she sank against the arm of Edmund Prowse, who had hastened to her side, though his expression betrayed more irritation than sympathy. Already several gentlemen had surged forward. The doctor, stout and red-faced Dr. Pendleton, set down his half-finished scone with brusque decisiveness and adjusted his hat. "Stay where you are, Mrs. Howard. I'll see to this. Trent may have had a seizure. It happens to men of his years." His tone was brisk, even hopeful, as if he clung to the possibility of a natural explanation. Yet there was an undercurrent of anxiety there, too. Miss Marple remained where she was, composed, her hands folded neatly over the handle of her parasol. She observed the scene with that mild detachment which so often concealed her sharpest thoughts. She noticed that Clara's distress, though real enough, was not untinged with another emotion, fear perhaps, or even guilt. She saw too the way Edmund Prowse, far from comforting the girl, glanced over his shoulder toward the orchard, his jaw tightening. The little procession moved off across the grass, Dr. Pendleton, Mr. Prowse supporting Clara, 2 or 3 of the younger men pressing ahead with a sense of purpose, and the Reverend Howard following behind. murmuring prayers beneath his breath. The rest of the guests stood uncertainly by the tea tables, whispering in hurried undertones. "Terrible thing," said Mrs. Ellison, her voice low but carrying, though not altogether unexpected. "Old Trent was never a well man." "Nonsense," sniffed Mrs. Price Ridley, who prided herself on plain speaking. "I was as hale as you please for his years. Rode that bicycle of his every morning without fail. No, mark my words, this is something more than a fit or faint." The words hung in the air, audacious, but they struck a chord. Heads turned. Eyebrows lifted. In the way of villages, suspicion had already begun to germinate. It was not long before confirmation came. Dr. Pendleton returned with an uncharacteristic solemnity, his hat in his hand. The little group with him looked pale and shaken. Clara clung to a handkerchief, trembling, while Edmund Prowse muttered a few words in her ear. "I'm afraid it is as Miss Barnes said," Dr. Pendleton announced heavily. "Trent is dead. There is a wound at the back of his head. Looks as though he was struck down. Violence, I fear." A collective gasp went up. Several ladies cried out. Mrs. Howard all but collapsed onto a chair. The vicar raised his voice in solemn tones. "We must remain calm, my friends. Calm and pray for his soul." But calm was no longer possible. Already theories began to fly. Who had last seen Trent? Had he quarreled with anyone? Could it have been an accident? Perhaps he fell, struck his head against a stone. Miss Marple listened. She always listened. But her gaze had shifted quietly toward the church clock, whose miscount of the hour had so unsettled her earlier. 6 chimes at 4, a curious thing, and she wondered, not for the first time, that coincidences were seldom so innocent as they seemed. Meanwhile, Dr. Pendleton urged that the constable be summoned at once. "Can't be helped, Howard. We must fetch Constable Graves. He'll want to seal off the orchard." The vicar sent young Tom Ellison running down the lane, and soon enough the heavy tread of boots heralded the constable's arrival. Graves was a tall, broad man with a weather-beaten face and a methodical manner. He listened gravely to the doctor's account, then insisted on viewing the body himself. The villagers, meanwhile, huddled in small knots, whispering eagerly. Miss Hartnell, who knew every scandal within 10 miles, was already recounting how Mr. Trent had quarrelled with his nephew over money only the week before. I heard them myself, raised voices in the high street, about inheritance and such. "You may depend upon it, money is at the root of this." Others suggested Clara Barnes had looked particularly distressed. Perhaps she had stumbled upon the crime in progress? And why had Edmund Prowse been so quick to follow her? Their closeness, though not openly acknowledged, was known well enough. Miss Marple let the tide of speculation wash over her. She did not contribute, but her mind filed away each careless word, each fleeting glance. She knew well that in such moments people betrayed more than they intended. Constable Graves returned after a time, face set grimly. "No doubt about it," he said. "The man's skull's been fractured. Likely struck from behind with some blunt object. Can't have been a fall, not with a wound like that. This is murder, make no mistake." The word murder fell like a stone among them. There it was, bald and ugly. Murder in St. Aldith's at the very garden party. The constable looked around at the assembled guests, his expression stern. "None of you is to leave until I've taken statements. You'll all understand. Dr. Pendleton, you'll stay by me while I send for the inspector from Much Widcombe. This is a serious business. This is a serious business." The inspector's arrival was awaited with a strange mixture of dread and excitement. In the meantime, the guests did what villagers always do. They gossiped, embroidered, theorized. By the time Inspector Cray arrived from Much Widcombe, half the party were convinced that Mr. Trent had been felled by a stranger lurking in the orchard, while the other half suspected a quarrel with someone among their very number. Inspector Cray was a brisk, capable man, keen-eyed and quick in his judgments. He questioned Clara Barnes first, for it was she who had raised the alarm. Clara repeated her tale in a trembling voice, how she had wandered into the orchard, looking for a quiet spot when she stumbled upon the body. She denied seeing anyone else there. Edmund Prowse confirmed her words, though he seemed impatient with the whole business, as if it were beneath his dignity to be questioned. Other villagers gave their accounts, where they had been at the hour of the murder, what they had seen or heard. Most had little to tell, though Miss Hartnell claimed she had heard a peculiar sound, like a scuffle or a branch snapping, some 10 minutes before Clara's discovery. Inspector Cray frowned thoughtfully. "And the time, ma'am? Can you be precise?" Miss Hartnell pursed her lips. "It was just before the clock struck. 4 o'clock sharp, or what should have been 4. "The clock struck 6, someone pointed out. "Exactly," said Miss Hartnell triumphantly. 6 when it ought to have been 4. "A most peculiar thing," the inspector grunted, making a note. But Miss Marple's eyes flickered, for she too had marked that curious error. And in her mind threads began, ever so faintly, to weave together. The inspector then turned his attention to Mr. Trent's character and circumstances. What enemies might he have had? What grievances? It soon emerged that Mr. Trent, though outwardly respectable, had made himself unpopular in certain quarters. He was a retired solicitor, known for his sharp dealings and occasional parsimony. Rumours suggested he had been pressing Clara Barnes's family for repayment of an old debt. Others spoke of quarrels with his nephew over the disposal of family property. Miss Marple, listening quietly, thought again of human nature. People rarely killed without cause, and the cause was usually money, love, or fear. She considered Clara's terrified expression, Edmund's curiously detached concern, the gossip about the nephew, and the strange business of the clock. Each might mean nothing or everything. As dusk began to gather, the inspector concluded his initial inquiries. The body had been removed to Dr. Pendleton's surgery, there to await the coroner. The guests, subdued now, dispersed in little groups, their earlier gaiety quite extinguished. Yet even in their shock they could not resist whispering, "Who would have thought such a thing possible here in St. Aldiths? Murder, like something from the newspapers in their own orchard." Miss Marple lingered a little apart, watching the shadows lengthen across the lawn. She said nothing, offered no opinion, but in her heart she felt a chill. For she knew too well that when murder came to a village, it was never the work of strangers. The seeds of it were always sown close to home, among the very people who sipped tea and exchanged polite greetings, and as she turned to leave, she murmured quietly to herself, 6, when it should have been 4. Yes, a most curious thing indeed. Would you like me to carry this forward into Section 3, Early Investigation, around 1,500 words, where the inspector presses the inquiries? Suspects begin to emerge, and Miss Marple starts to make her first quiet observations. The evening air carried with it a strange heaviness, as though the village itself held its breath. The vicarage lawns, so recently alive with chatter and the tinkling of teacups, were now almost deserted. Only a few stragglers lingered, speaking in low, urgent voices before making their way down the lane. Miss Marple, who had remained seated long after most had departed, finally gathered her shawl about her shoulders and set off at her gentle, unhurried pace. Though she gave the appearance of a kindly old lady retiring after a taxing afternoon, her mind was far from rest. Each detail of the day moved through her thoughts with the precision of clockwork. Clara's trembling hand, Edmund's irritated frown, Dr. Pendleton's quick eagerness to declare natural causes, and above all the strange double chime of the parish clock. To most it had been nothing but a quaint mishap. To Miss Marple it was a note out of tune in a well-rehearsed melody. And such discord often pointed to something deeper. By the time she reached her neat little cottage on the edge of the village, the sky was streaked with mauve and grey. She lit a lamp, brewed herself a small pot of tea, and sat by the window overlooking the lane. Lamps flickered to life in the cottages beyond, each one a pocket of domestic calm. Yet behind those curtained windows she knew, tongues would wag far into the night. St. Aldiths would not soon recover from the shock of a murder in its midst. Sure enough, the next morning brought an air of restless energy to the village. Mrs. Price Ridley was seen making 3 separate calls before noon, each time with a purposeful tilt of her hat and an air of grave importance. Miss Hartnell, though she had already provided the inspector with her observations, seemed unable to stop repeating them to anyone who would listen. The grocer's shop was crowded with customers who had no particular need of flour or sugar, but who lingered nonetheless, eager for the latest morsel of gossip. Constable Graves trudged from door to door, collecting additional statements, though most had little to add. It was Inspector Cray, however, who made the real progress. By late morning he had established that Mr. Trent had indeed quarrelled with his nephew, a young man named Geoffrey Trent, over matters of inheritance. Geoffrey lived in Much Widcombe, but had been seen in St. Aldith's only 2 days before the murder. His temper, it was said, was short, and his fondness for gambling had long been a source of contention between him and his uncle. Equally compelling was the matter of Clara Barnes. Several villagers confirmed that Mr. Trent had pressed the Barnes family for repayment of a debt. The Barnes household, already in straitened circumstances, had been placed under severe strain. Clara, it was whispered, had been seen in distress more than once following an encounter with the old man. The inspector, methodical in his way, considered both possibilities with equal gravity. "Money," he remarked to Constable Graves as they stood by the orchard gate, "is the motive in 9 cases out of 10. Either the nephew wanting his inheritance sooner rather than later, or the Barnes girl driven to desperation. We shall see soon enough." Miss Marple, who happened to be passing with her basket on the way to the post office, overheard the remark, but said nothing. She gave a polite nod to the inspector and continued on her way, her thoughts moving more delicately than his blunt conclusion. Clara, poor child, might indeed have cause for despair, but Miss Marple could not quite reconcile the trembling girl with the cold brutality of a blow to the skull. Desperation led to many things, but rarely to violence so decisive, so calculated. Later that afternoon, the inspector called together several of the villagers in the vicarage drawing-room to hear their accounts once more. Miss Marple, having been present at the party, was among them. The room was heavy with tension, as Clara sat pale and withdrawn. Edmund Prowse at her side, his arm protectively about her chair. Mrs. Ellison, with her habit of wringing her hands, offered little beyond nervous platitudes. Dr. Pendleton, still red-faced from the exertions of the day before, repeated his opinion that the blow had been struck with considerable force. It was then that the inspector produced a small object, wrapped in a handkerchief. With a certain relish he laid it on the table, a heavy brass candlestick, its base stained dark. "Found in the long grass at the edge of the orchard," he announced. "I think you'll agree, Doctor, that this could have done the trick." A murmur went around the room. Mrs. Price Ridley drew back in horror, while Clara gave a little gasp. Edmund's jaw tightened visibly. "Do any of you recognize it?" The inspector pressed. No one spoke at first. Then Miss Hartnell, always quick to offer her knowledge, said, "I believe that belonged to the Trents. Part of a pair, wasn't it? They were shown at the church jumble some years back, though of course Mr. Trent never donated them. I dare say his nephew would know more." The inspector nodded, clearly pleased. "Yes, I've already sent word to Much Widcombe. We'll have Geoffrey Trent here soon enough." Miss Marple's eyes, however, rested not on the candlestick but on Edmund Prowse. His reaction had been too swift, too guarded, almost as though he feared the candlestick might be linked to him in some way. She said nothing, only observed, the corners of her mouth turned down in that expression of vague puzzlement which concealed her shrewdest insights. After the meeting broke up, Miss Marple lingered in the doorway. Clara was leaving, leaning heavily on Edmund's arm. The girl's eyes were swollen with weeping, her voice barely above a whisper, as she thanked Mrs. Howard for her kindness. Edmund, however, cast a glance back toward the inspector, his face grim, as if calculating something. Miss Marple thought of another pair she had once known in a different village, a young woman in difficulty, and a man who appeared devoted but whose devotion masked impatience and self-interest. Human nature, after all, did not change from one parish to another. That evening brought further stirrings. Geoffrey Trent arrived from Much Widcombe in a state of high indignation. He stormed into the vicarage with barely a word of greeting, demanding to know what all this talk of suspicion was about. His uncle, he admitted, had been a difficult man, but he swore he had not set eyes on him since their quarrel 2 days prior. The inspector was not convinced and pressed him closely. Where had he been at the hour of the murder? Geoffrey claimed he had been at the Crown Inn in Much Widcombe, playing billiards until well past 5. Several witnesses confirmed it, though with the reservation that Geoffrey had stepped out for a time around 3:30. The inspector seized upon this. "Enough time certainly to make the journey here, do the deed and return," he declared. Geoffrey denied it hotly, but his temper did him no favours. He railed against the injustice of it all, his voice rising until the vicar himself intervened with a word of calm. Miss Marple, seated quietly in a corner, noted the bluster, the anger, the lack of subtlety. A guilty man, she reflected, often sought to protest too much or too little, But there was another kind of man, too, one whose anger was real but who was guilty only of foolishness. She wondered which Geoffrey Trent might be. The following days were filled with little discoveries, each one seized upon by the villagers with avid interest. It was revealed that Clara Barnes had been in Mr. Trent's company only the previous week, leaving his house in tears. Some said she had been pleading for more time to settle her family's debt. Others whispered that Trent had made improper advances, though such talk was hushed quickly in the presence of ladies. There were whispers, too, about Edmund Prowse. His business dealings in the city had suffered of late, and it was known he had invested unwisely. His attachment to Clara might be genuine, but some suggested it was as much about her family's land as it was about affection. If Mr. Trent had threatened the Barnes family with ruin, Edmund's interests were entangled as well. Miss Marple heard all, as she always did, her knitting needles clicking gently as neighbours poured their theories into her sitting room. She encouraged them with little nods, with quiet murmurs of, "How very interesting," and "Oh, do go on," until they had revealed far more than they intended. On the third day after the murder, she ventured into the orchard herself. Constable Graves, recognizing her as a harmless presence, allowed her to wander a little while he spoke with the inspector. Miss Marple moved slowly, her eyes on the ground, noting the trampled grass, the broken branch that Miss Hartnell had mentioned, the faint imprint of a shoe near the edge of the path. She bent down, touching the earth with a gentle hand, then straightened with a small sigh. To most eyes it was a scene of confusion. To hers it was a pattern forming, faint but discernible. The blow had been struck not in passion but with calculation. The weapon had been carried there deliberately, then cast aside. The timing, too, the clock striking the wrong hour at the moment of discovery, was no mere coincidence. Someone had meant to distract, to confuse, to mislead. As she left the orchard, she passed Clara Barnes walking with Edmund. The girl's face was pale, her eyes shadowed with misery. Edmund spoke in low, urgent tones, his hand gripping her arm. Clara seemed to shrink under his words. Miss Marple paused, unseen behind the hedge, and caught a fragment. "Say nothing more, do you understand? It will only make things worse." She moved on quietly, her expression serene. But in her heart a certainty was growing. The pieces were aligning, though the picture was not yet complete. She knew enough of human weakness to see that secrets, when pressed, had a way of rising to the surface. And as she returned to her little cottage, she thought once more of the parish clock, its 6 chimes ringing where 4 should have sounded. "Clocks don't strike the wrong hour without reason," she murmured to herself. "Someone wound it so, or someone interfered. And that someone, I think, is nearer to us than we like to believe. Would you like me to carry forward into Section 4, First Suspects, 1500 words, where the inspector begins pressing on Clara and Geoffrey, while Miss Marple notices the subtle cracks forming in Edmund's facade?" The inspector had made up his mind. From the moment the candlestick was found in the orchard, and the gossip of debts and quarrels circulated with feverish insistence, his path of inquiry narrowed toward the most obvious targets. Geoffrey Trent, hot-tempered and opportunistic, with much to gain from his uncle's death. And Clara Barnes, desperate, perhaps cornered beyond endurance by threats of ruin. The villagers, eager for resolution, lent their voices to these suspicions, some with relish, others with solemn disapproval. The notion of the guilty party being a stranger had all but vanished. Everyone accepted, with a kind of fearful fascination, that the murderer must be one of their own. Inspector Cray summoned Geoffrey Trent once more to the vicarage. Geoffrey entered with his usual restless energy, striding across the floor with his chin lifted defiantly, though his eyes betrayed a nervous flicker. He was questioned closely about the afternoon of the garden party, the quarrel 2 days before, and his movements thereafter. His alibi at the Crown Inn was imperfect. Yes, several men had seen him there, but his absence for nearly half an hour in the middle of the afternoon remained troubling. Geoffrey insisted that he had stepped outside merely to smoke a cigarette and had not gone far from the inn-yard. Constable Graves, who sat stolidly beside the inspector, remarked that it was certainly possible to have ridden over to St. Aldith's in that time if one were quick on a bicycle. Geoffrey flared at the suggestion, swearing he had done no such thing. "My uncle was an obstinate old tyrant, but he was still family. I'd quarrel with him, yes, but kill him? That's another matter altogether." His voice shook with indignation, but in the silence that followed, It was hard to tell whether the indignation was born of innocence or of fear at being cornered. Clara Barnes fared no better. She was summoned the following morning, pale and trembling, to sit opposite the inspector. Edmund Prowse accompanied her, though his presence seemed more domineering than protective. He answered some of the inspector's questions for her, until Cray brusquely reminded him that it was Clara's testimony required, not his. Clara stumbled through her account, her voice low, her eyes darting toward Edmund as though for reassurance or warning. She admitted, reluctantly, that she had pleaded with Mr. Trent the week before his death, asking for leniency on her family's debt. He was unkind, she said, her voice faltering. He said dreadful things, that my father was useless, that we would lose the cottage. He frightened me. When pressed, she denied that Trent had laid a hand on her or made advances, though her cheeks burned crimson at the suggestion. "And when you found him in the orchard?" the inspector asked. "You were the first, you say? You saw no one else nearby?" Clara shook her head violently. "No, no one. I only saw him lying there." I screamed and ran back. "That is all." The inspector leaned back, studying her. "You were in tears when you returned. You've admitted you were in despair over his treatment of your family. He threatened you, drove you into terror. Isn't it true, Miss Barnes, that you went there to confront him, and in a moment of rage—" Clara broke into sobs, protesting her innocence, while Edmund sprang to his feet, his voice sharp. "That's enough. She's a frightened girl, not a murderess. If you want a culprit, look to Geoffrey Trent, who had everything to gain." The inspector silenced him, but the seed was sown. Clara had been seen as delicate and harmless, but now the possibility of hidden desperation had been laid bare before the village. Whispers grew louder that evening at the grocer's and the post office. "It is always the quiet ones," Mrs. Ellison said knowingly. Driven past Baring, she might have struck out. Others shook their heads and whispered of Geoffrey's hot blood, his gambling debts, his temper. 2 clear suspects stood before them, and many believed it only a matter of days before one of them would be taken away in handcuffs. Miss Marple, however, remained unconvinced. She had watched Clara's trembling hands, the way her eyes darted to Edmund before answering. It was not the fear of a guilty conscience, but the fear of saying the wrong thing, of betraying something unspeakable. Nor did she believe Geoffrey's blustering temper was proof of guilt. She had known young men of his sort before. Rash, foolish, quick to anger, but not capable of a crime requiring calculation and timing. His very temperament was too open, too visible. The true murderer, Miss Marple thought, was someone of a cooler disposition, capable of concealment. The question of the parish clock returned to her mind again and again. 6 chimes instead of 4. At the precise moment Clara discovered the body. It was not a mistake that could occur by chance. Someone had tampered with the clock, and they had done so to confuse the time of the crime. If Clara discovered Trent at 4, but the village believed it to be 6, the alibis of several people would appear stronger than they were. It was a subtle manipulation, one that spoke of forethought. On the 4th day, another revelation disturbed the village. Dr. Pendleton, in going through Mr. Trent's effects, discovered a small leather ledger filled with careful notations of debts owed to him by various villagers. Clara's family's debt was indeed listed there, circled in red ink, the amount underlined twice. But there was another name, less expected, Edmund Prowse. The inspector seized upon this eagerly. It was known that Edmund's business in the city had faltered, but the ledger showed a significant loan outstanding to Mr. Trent, more than enough to ruin Edmund if pressed. Suddenly Edmund's outburst in Clara's defense, his sharp interjections during questioning, and his visible unease when the candlestick was produced, all took on a new shade of meaning. Miss Marple, hearing the news from Mrs. Price Ridley that afternoon, knitted silently for a long moment. "How very curious," she murmured. "People will often defend others with great warmth when they are in truth defending themselves. One sees it often." Mrs. Price Ridley looked puzzled, but Miss Marple merely smiled her gentle, apologetic smile and asked for another cup of tea. By the following morning, suspicion in the village had shifted subtly. Where once Clara had seemed most vulnerable to doubt, now Edmund's name was whispered with equal vigor. Some thought he might have killed Trent to protect Clara, others that he had done it to protect himself from financial ruin. Edmund himself grew more strained under the pressure. He walked the village with a taut, purposeful stride, his jaw set, his eyes wary. To those who greeted him, he returned only curt replies. Clara, by contrast, grew paler and more withdrawn, as though the life were being drained from her. Inspector Cray called Edmund in for formal questioning, producing the ledger as evidence. Edmund admitted the debt, but dismissed it as trivial in comparison to his overall affairs. An inconvenience, nothing more, he said, though his tone carried little conviction. When asked where he had been at the time of the murder, he claimed he had been assisting Mrs. Howard with carrying chairs from the shed. Mrs. Howard, when asked, confirmed that Edmund had indeed helped her, but the timing was vague. She could not swear whether it had been closer to 3 o'clock or 4:30. The confusion of the clock's striking left her even less certain. Miss Marple listened to this exchange with particular interest. Her vague alibi, supported by a lady unlikely to recall the precise hour, and all too convenient that the confusion of the clock provided cover. Yes, it was becoming clearer. Someone had meddled with that clock, and that someone must be tied closely to the moment of the crime. Yet Miss Marple knew the inspector would not see it. Men like Cray looked for blunt motives and blunt instruments. They did not see the subtler patterns of human conduct, the small betrayals of expression and manner that spoke more loudly than words. But Miss Marple had made a life study of such things. She knew the way people lied, the way they concealed, the way they sought to protect themselves, and she knew with increasing certainty that the true danger did not lie in Clara's trembling hands or Geoffrey's bluster, but in the smooth control of a man who feared exposure more than anything. Still she said nothing. To speak too soon was to risk alarming the guilty. Better to wait, to watch, to let them betray themselves, and so she went about the village as usual, attending to her knitting and her garden, calling on neighbours with little gifts of jam, all the while storing away each scrap of gossip and each stray remark. One afternoon, as she sat in Mrs. Ellison's parlour, she listened as her hostess repeated the familiar tale of the clock. It was the oddest thing, Jane, 6 chimes instead of 4. But then that clock has always been troublesome. My late husband used to say it never kept proper time. Miss Marple looked up mildly. Oh, but it does, dear. I recall it being most punctual when the church was repaired last spring. And clocks, you know, do not alter themselves. Someone must have seen to it. Mrs. Ellison gasped, her eyes wide. You mean deliberately? Miss Marple smiled her faint smile, as if she had said something of no importance. Oh, one never knows. Such little oddities often have quite simple explanations. But one cannot help noticing. And as she walked home through the gathering dusk, she murmured to herself once more, 6 instead of 4. The murderer thought it very clever. But cleverness, I have always observed, is most dangerous to the one who employs it. It draws attention, when quiet simplicity would pass unnoticed. And in this case it may yet prove their undoing. She paused at her garden gate, glancing back down the lane. Edmund Prowse was just turning the corner with Clara on his arm, speaking to her in low, urgent tones. Clara's head was bowed, her face pale in the twilight, while Edmund's hand gripped her elbow with a firmness that belied his courteous smile as he tipped his hat to a passer-by. Miss Marple's eyes softened with a mixture of pity and resolve. Poor Clara, caught in a web of fear not entirely of her own making. And Edmund, smooth, controlled, but with cracks beginning to show. The inspector might pursue the nephew or the frightened girl, but Miss Marple knew where the truth would be found. And in time the truth would out, for secrets could no more remain hidden in St. Aldith's than weeds could fail to spring up in a well-tended garden. Would you like me to continue into Section 5, A Hidden Clue, 1,500 words, where Miss Marple discovers a small but decisive detail overlooked by everyone else, one that shifts her suspicions from theory into certainty? The days that followed settled into a strange rhythm, as though the village had wrapped itself in a veil of unease. St. Aldith's was never truly quiet. There was always the chatter at the grocer's, the ringing of the blacksmith's hammer, the children's laughter as they played by the green. But beneath it all lay a constant tension, a prickle of fear that had not existed before. Conversations that once lingered comfortably in the lanes now broke off when footsteps approached. Neighbours greeted one another with smiles that were polite, but too quickly withdrawn. Everyone seemed to be watching everyone else. Miss Marple, with her soft step and her quiet eyes, noticed all of it. She heard the lowering of voices when she entered a shop, the quick glances exchanged between customers. Some thought the inspector was on the right track, closing in on Geoffrey or Clara. Others whispered that Edmund was far too confident, too smooth in his answers. Yet no one truly felt secure. The knowledge that a murderer walked among them hung in the air like mist. Inspector Cray, for his part, believed himself close to resolution. He had already hinted to Constable Graves that one of his suspects might soon face charges. The candlestick, the ledger, the quarrels, all these seemed to him sufficient groundwork. Yet he was careful, for he knew the coroner's inquest was approaching, and it was there that he must present his findings with weight and clarity. The evidence, though circumstantial, pointed with convenient directness to those already under suspicion. Miss Marple, however, was more occupied with details others overlooked. She made her customary visits in the days leading up to the inquest, calling upon friends and neighbours, never pressing questions but allowing conversation to flow as it would. In such unguarded moments, truths often revealed themselves. She found herself at Mrs. Price Ridley's one afternoon, where the lady was full of indignation about the inspector's handling of matters. "Mark my words, Jane, it'll be the Barnes girl who suffers. A weaker creature I never saw. She's bound to falter, and they'll take that for guilt. And yet I always say it's the men who cause trouble, never the women." Miss Marple only smiled faintly. "I've often noticed," she replied mildly, "that desperation in young girls usually leads to flight rather than violence. Quite a different thing, you know. One runs away from one's troubles more often than one strikes them down." The conversation drifted on, but the thought lingered with Miss Marple. Clara, for all her trembling, had not run. She had stayed, even returned to the scene of her distress. That in itself was curious. 2 mornings later, Miss Marple paid a call upon Dr. Pendleton, under the pretence of asking after his gout. The doctor, flattered and a little bored, was quick to share what he knew of the case. He spoke of the wound at the back of Mr. Trent's head, the force with which the blow had been delivered. "Not a light hand," he said firmly. "Whoever struck him meant it. One sharp blow, not a struggle," he added, almost as an afterthought, that Mr. Trent's pocket watch had been found broken, the glass shattered. The hand stopped at 20 minutes past 3. Miss Marple's eyes flickered, though she gave only a soft murmur of sympathy for the late Mr. Trent. 20 minutes past 3. The cry had gone up just after the clock struck its 6 erroneous chimes at 4. The pocket watch told one story, the parish clock another. Someone had tampered with one to obscure the other. She thought of the orchard path, the trampled grass, the shoe print near the hedge. It was all becoming clearer. That same afternoon, as she took her customary stroll past the church, she paused to admire the roses climbing the lich gate. A little boy, Jimmy Ellison, came running by, his knees scuffed from play. Seeing Miss Marple, he stopped to chatter, eager for attention. "Mum says I mustn't go near the orchard," he confided, eyes wide with the solemnity of forbidden ground. "But I saw Mr. Prowse there the day before, winding the clock. He told me to run along and not be underfoot. He was ever so cross." Miss Marple bent slightly, her expression one of mild interest. "Mr. Prowse, you say? Winding the clock? That's a very important job, Jimmy. Not many are allowed to do it." Jimmy nodded earnestly. "He said the vicar was busy and he'd see to it. But the clock struck wrong after, didn't it?" She sent the boy off with a smile and a barley sugar sweet from her reticule. Her heart, however, beat faster than usual. Edmund Prowse at the church clock. It explained much. He had opportunity, and with his debt in Trent's ledger he had motive too. Clara's fear, the way she clung to him yet seemed cowed in his presence, spoke of someone under pressure rather than protected. That evening Miss Marple sat by her fire, her knitting lying idle in her lap. She traced the chain of events in her mind. Trent, an obstinate man with enemies enough. Clara, frightened but too frail for violence. Geoffrey, rash but incapable of the subtlety required. Edmund, smooth and careful, entangled financially with reason to silence Trent before his demands became ruinous. And the clock, striking 6 instead of 4, placing him near the very heart of the deception. Yes, the pattern was clearer now, but Miss Marple knew better than to speak prematurely. A hidden clue once seen must be tested. A suspicion must be allowed to ripen until it bore undeniable fruit. She had learned long ago that direct accusation frightened the guilty into silence. while patient observation drew them into betraying themselves. The coroner's inquest was held the following morning in the parish hall, and the whole village seemed to gather for it. Miss Marple arrived early, taking her place among the spectators with her usual air of unassuming interest. She listened as Dr. Pendleton gave his medical evidence, as Constable Graves described the discovery of the candlestick, and as Inspector Cray laid out the quarrels, the debts, and the suspicions surrounding Geoffrey and Clara. Geoffrey blustered once more under questioning, swearing to his innocence, but only succeeding in sounding defensive. Clara, pale and trembling, faltered so badly that Edmund had to steady her arm as she left the witness stand. The murmurs among the villagers grew. Some thought the case against Clara clear enough. Others muttered that Geoffrey's temper condemned him. Few spoke of Edmund at all, for his calm composure seemed unassailable. But Miss Marple watched closely. She saw the way Edmund's lips pressed thin when Geoffrey was questioned, the flicker of unease when the inspector mentioned the pocket watch. She saw too how Clara glanced at him continually, as though fearful of displeasing him with any careless word. And when the jury returned an open verdict, death by violence, but insufficient evidence to name the killer, she noted the quick tightening of Edmund's jaw before he masked it with a courteous bow. That afternoon, as villagers spilled into the lane with voices full of speculation, Miss Marple made her way quietly to the church. She stood beneath the tower gazing up at the clock face, its hands pointed serenely at 2:30, as though it had never erred. Yet she knew better. The wrong chime at the wrong hour had been deliberate, and Edmund Prowse, caught by a child's innocent observation, had been at the mechanism. She thought of human nature, of the small vanities and weaknesses that led people astray. Edmund, proud and ambitious, had tied his future to Clara. But Trent's demands threatened ruin. To silence the old man was tempting enough, but to strike him in the orchard during the party and to tamper with the clock so the timing would cast suspicion elsewhere, that required both cunning and calculation. And Miss Marple knew with the quiet certainty of experience that such cunning was always accompanied by a flaw, some overlooked detail that would betray the whole design. As she turned from the church, she resolved to find that flaw. The candlestick, the pocket watch, the wrong hour, these were threads. She must draw them together into a knot that even Inspector Cray could not deny. And when she did, Edmund Prowse's smooth composure would crack and the truth would stand revealed. Miss Marple, humming softly to herself, walked homeward beneath the evening sky. The roses in her garden glowed faintly in the fading light, their beauty undisturbed by human folly. She settled once more by her hearth, her knitting resumed, her needles clicking in a steady rhythm. To any passer-by she was but an old lady at her work, but behind her serene expression the web was tightening, and the murderer, though still at large, was already caught in its threads. Would you like me to carry forward into Section 6, Confrontations and Secrets, 1,500 words, where villagers' past grievances come to light and Edmund's mask begins to slip under pressure? The aftermath of the inquest left the village in a state of uneasy suspension. An open verdict, death by violence at the hands of person or persons unknown. Such words carried with them neither closure nor comfort. The villagers had expected resolution, someone led away under suspicion, something to settle their nerves. Instead, the case remained as murky as ever, and in the absence of certainty, suspicion thickened like fog. People looked harder at their neighbors, clung more tightly to whispers, and in every face they read the possibility of guilt. Inspector Cray remained steadfast in his belief that the answer lay between Geoffrey Trent and Clara Barnes, but his frustration was mounting. Geoffrey had blustered and stormed his way through his testimony, his anger ringing with truth or deceit. One could not tell. Clara had faltered pitiably, her trembling almost indistinguishable from concealment, and Edmund Prowse, who had sat silently through much of it, emerged curiously unscathed in the eyes of many. His calm composure seemed to shield him, though to Miss Marple's eye, the mask of control had grown tighter with every passing day. It was in such moments of communal uncertainty that old grievances and hidden resentments tended to rise to the surface. Within days, St. Aldith's was alive not only with talk of the murder, but with the excavation of past quarrels and slights, each one weighed as though it might contain the seed of deadly motive. Mrs. Ellison recalled a time when Mr. Trent had refused her husband a small loan to keep their dairy afloat. He said it was against his principles to lend without security, she confided bitterly to Miss Hartnell, who promptly repeated the tale to 3 others. The blacksmith muttered that Trent had once taken him to court over a boundary dispute, and though the matter was years past, the anger still smouldered. Even Mrs. Price Ridley, who prided herself on her own rectitude, admitted with tight lips that Trent had questioned the propriety of her late husband's accounts when he was church treasurer. The village, in its collective voice, seemed to paint Trent as a man universally disliked, a miser, whose sharp dealings had left scars in nearly every household. But dislike, however strong, did not in itself constitute murder. Miss Marple knew this well. To dislike one's neighbour was common enough, but to strike them down required something more immediate, more personal: fear, desperation, or the preservation of one's own standing. In the midst of these rumblings, Edmund Prowse's position became curiously precarious. The discovery of his debt in Trent's ledger had circulated quietly at first, but by the week's end it was on every tongue. At the post office, Mrs. Ellison whispered that Edmund had borrowed recklessly, that his fine suits and polished manners masked a man on the brink of financial collapse. At the baker's, Miss Hartnell went further, suggesting that Edmund intended to marry Clara only to secure her family's land and would have done anything to remove the obstacle of Trent's claims. By the time the story had travelled the length of the High Street, it was said as fact that Edmund's entire livelihood had depended upon silencing the old man. Edmund, who had long walked the lanes with an air of self-assurance, now moved more quickly, his eyes narrowed, his jaw set. His greetings were curt, his smile perfunctory, and Clara, always pale since the day of the murder, grew more wan still. Those who passed the pair together noted the way Edmund's hand often rested on her arm, firm, almost guiding, as though she were something fragile in danger of breaking, or something dangerous in need of restraint. Miss Marple observed them once on the green, where Clara had paused to speak with young Tom Ellison, who offered her a small posy of flowers. Edmund had drawn her away almost at once, speaking sharply, though his expression softened when others looked on. Clara's eyes, however, betrayed her misery. Miss Marple's own heart ached to see it. She knew well the look of a young woman in the grip of fear, not of what she had done, but of what she dared not say. It was a small thing that turned her thoughts more firmly. Passing through the churchyard one afternoon, she encountered Mr. Hargreaves, the sexton, a stooped man with keen eyes. They fell into conversation about the upkeep of the grounds, but soon he lowered his voice. "Strange thing about that clock, ma'am," he remarked. "Never had trouble with it before. I keep it wound regular every Saturday. Yet come Sunday it was all wrong. Struck 6 when it should have been 4. Miss Marple's expression was one of mild surprise. "How very curious," she murmured. "You say you wind it each Saturday?" "Then it should not have needed attention the very next day." "Just so, ma'am. I can't make sense of it, unless someone else took it upon themselves to meddle. Though who'd do such a thing?" Miss Marple did not answer at once, but her thoughts moved swiftly. Jimmy Ellison's innocent remark about Edmund winding the clock had been no child's fancy, and now the sexton's testimony confirmed what she already suspected, that the interference had been deliberate. Not chance, not accident, but the calculated act of someone who wished to obscure the hour of death. The pieces pressed closer together. Edmund had motive in his debt, opportunity in his presence near the orchard, and cunning enough to manipulate time itself to cast suspicion upon others. His composure, so carefully maintained, was not the calm of innocence but the mask of one who feared discovery. Yet Miss Marple, cautious as ever, did not allow her conviction to show. Instead, she went on with her quiet calls and gentle inquiries, listening as the village secrets spilled forth in their usual fashion. She heard of a maid dismissed years ago for theft, of a love affair whispered to have taken place behind hedgerows, of a quarrel between brothers over an inheritance. None of these tales touched the heart of the murder, yet each added to the web of resentments in which St. Aldith seemed to live entangled. And she knew that such resentments, while real, were not the hand that had wielded the candlestick. The true revelation came one evening when Miss Marple sat in Mrs. Howard's drawing-room with a small group of ladies. The conversation turned inevitably to the murder, and Mrs. Ellison, her voice hushed, confided that Clara had been seen leaving Mr. Trent's house in tears only a week before his death. Mrs. Price Ridley, with her usual bluntness, suggested that Trent might have threatened scandal if Clara refused his terms. Though she was vague on what those terms might have been, Miss Marple, knitting steadily, spoke softly. "I should not think Mr. Trent was a man given to idle threats. If he said he would act, then he would act, whether to call in a debt or to make trouble for others. Such certainty can drive some to desperate measures, especially if another's fortunes are tied to it." There was a murmur of agreement, though the ladies did not see the quiet significance in her words. Miss Marple, however, had noted Clara's silence whenever the matter of Trent's threats was raised. The girl feared not the dead man, but the living one at her side, and Miss Marple, who had seen many such cases, understood that Edmund's protectiveness was a guise, one that concealed both control and guilt. That night, as she returned to her cottage beneath the hush of stars, Miss Marple resolved upon a course of action. To wait longer was to risk Edmund tightening his hold upon Clara until she could no longer breathe. It was time to bring matters closer to the surface, to draw Edmund out of his composure and into betraying himself. For Miss Marple knew that the guilty, once rattled, often revealed more than they intended. She sat by her fire and reviewed the chain once more, the quarrel, the debt, the manipulation of the clock. The candlestick cast aside Clara's terror, Edmund's mask. The threads were all there, woven into a net. The village might still argue between Geoffrey and Clara, but she saw the truth in plain daylight. All that remained was to make Edmund expose himself. The following morning, she sought out Inspector Cray, who was by then weary of the case. He listened with polite impatience as Miss Marple offered her thoughts, couching them as idle observations. "It seems to me," she said mildly, "that Mr. Prowse is very often in the way of things, quite near when he is needed, though curiously unaccounted for when it matters most. And of course one cannot help but remember that clocks do not strike the wrong hour, unless someone winds them so." The inspector frowned, but dismissed it with a shake of his head. "You're a shrewd lady, Miss Marple, but I've got to follow evidence, not fancies. Trent's nephew or the Barnes girl, that's where the case lies." Miss Marple only inclined her head with her usual humility. "Quite so, Inspector. I dare say you are right. Only I do think sometimes the evidence is not where we expect it to be. One must only listen for the small things." She left him then, knowing he would not act on her words. Men like Cray required a blunt confession or a hand caught in the act. Subtleties escaped them. And so it must fall to her to provide the means of exposure. As she walked home through the soft autumn air, Miss Marple's eyes shone with quiet resolve. She had seen enough of human weakness to know that Edmund's mask could not hold forever. One well-placed word, one subtle prod, and the facade would crumble. Then Clara would be freed from her silent terror. And St. Aldith's, though never quite the same again, would at least be delivered from the shadow of suspicion. And Miss Marple, gentle and composed, would be ready when the moment came. Would you like me to move forward into Section 7, another twist, 1,500 words, where a new revelation or crime shifts suspicion and heightens the stakes before Miss Marple begins her quiet test of Edmund? The days following Miss Marple's quiet conversation with Inspector Cray unfolded with deceptive calm. The inspector pressed on with his official line of inquiry, turning the weight of his attention back upon Geoffrey Trent, for Geoffrey's bluster and poor reputation made him an easy target. Clara, meanwhile, bore the brunt of the village's whispers. Some said she had killed in desperation, others that she was shielding Edmund, though few spoke such words aloud in his presence. Edmund himself continued to carry himself with that same surface composure, offering Clara his arm, speaking with measured courtesy to neighbours, answering questions with steady assurance. Yet Miss Marple saw what others did not: the tension in his jaw, the restless flicker of his eyes, the way Clara seemed diminished at his side, like a candle guttering in a draught. Then, one grey afternoon, another event shook the village and unsettled the course of the investigation. It was Mrs. Howard's maid who first raised the alarm, rushing breathlessly into the vicarage kitchen with news that there had been another incident, this time at the Barnes cottage. By the time Miss Marple arrived at the scene, having heard the gossip on her walk to the grocer's, a small crowd had already gathered in the lane. Clara sat on the cottage step, pale as paper, while her mother fussed beside her. Edmund stood apart, speaking in low, urgent tones with Inspector Cray and Constable Graves. The story was quickly pieced together. Clara had gone to the larder in the early evening to fetch flour when she noticed a folded paper left on the shelf. Opening it, she found a note written in a hurried scrawl. "Keep your mouth shut or you'll end like Trent." The shock had been so great that she had nearly fainted, and her cry had brought her mother running. The note was shown to the inspector, who frowned over it, muttering that it complicated matters considerably. The villagers seized upon the revelation with avid excitement. If Clara was being threatened, then surely she was innocent, unless some whispered it was all a ruse to divert suspicion. Edmund, with characteristic decisiveness, declared it an outrage, proof that Clara had been hounded by others from the first. "This is the work of someone desperate to shift guilt," he insisted, his voice carrying for all to hear. "If the inspector is looking for his culprit, he should look to my cousin Geoffrey. This smacks of his kind of recklessness." Geoffrey, when confronted, swore violently that he had done no such thing. "I may have had my differences with the old man, but I've never stooped to scaring girls with bits of paper," he shouted, his fists clenching. The inspector attempted to calm him, but his outburst only served to deepen the suspicion in many minds. Miss Marple, however, remained seated quietly on a low stone wall, her hands folded over her parasol. She had asked to see the note, and having done so, she tucked the observation carefully into her thoughts. The handwriting was crude, almost deliberately so, the letters jagged and uneven. To an untrained eye, it might appear the work of someone uneducated, even careless. But to Miss Marple, who had received countless notes and letters from neighbours of every station, it looked contrived. It was not the hand of Geoffrey, whose writing she had glimpsed once on a bill at the grocer's, neat, sloping, betraying his clerk's schooling. Nor did it resemble Clara's fine, hesitant script, which Miss Marple had observed on a note of thanks for a basket of preserves. No, this was the work of someone attempting to disguise his hand, and such disguises often revealed more than they concealed. The incident reignited gossip throughout the village. Some said it proved Clara was innocent and persecuted. Others, that it was a ploy to throw suspicion off herself. Geoffrey, already unpopular, found himself increasingly isolated. Clara, though pitied by some, was avoided by others, for fear of being entangled in scandal. Edmund, meanwhile, moved with greater confidence than before, his position apparently strengthened by the turn of events. He spoke firmly in Clara's defence, took her arm more openly in public, and seemed to relish the role of her protector. Yet Miss Marple noticed the faint tightness around his eyes, the way his hand pressed too firmly upon her arm, as though reminding her of something unspoken. 2 evenings later, Miss Marple had occasion to call upon Mrs. Howard, and found Edmund there in the drawing-room. He rose at once, courteous as ever, yet his eyes lingered on her with a flicker of wariness. He stayed only long enough to press Clara's hand and murmur a few words in her ear before excusing himself. When he had gone, Mrs. Howard sighed. "Such a pity," she said, her voice low. "Clara is quite changed since all this began. One would think she would find comfort in Edmund's attentions, yet she grows paler by the day. I sometimes fear his protectiveness is rather overwhelming." Miss Marple inclined her head gently. "Some men, dear, mistake protection for possession. It may be kindly meant, yet it weighs heavily upon the one who bears it." Mrs. Howard nodded, troubled, and Miss Marple tucked the remark away. She had seen it before, women hemmed in by the very men who claimed to shield them. It was not always cruelty, but it was always dangerous, for it silenced truth as effectively as fear. The investigation pressed on, though the inspector's patience was wearing thin. He interrogated Geoffrey once more, hoping to catch him in a contradiction. But Geoffrey's answers, though delivered hotly, remained consistent. Clara was pressed too, but her trembling denials yielded nothing new. The note, though suggestive, could not be traced. In the eyes of the inspector, the case remained balanced precariously between nephew and girl, while Edmund continued to pass beneath notice, his role overshadowed by louder tempers and weaker nerves. It was on a quiet Sunday morning, after service at the church, that Miss Marple found herself in conversation with young Tom Ellison once more. The boy had been playing near the vestry when he remarked with childish candour, "Mr. Prowse was here again, miss, after everyone left. I saw him by the clock tower looking ever so cross. He said it needed tending, but Mr. Hargreaves says it's been keeping proper time since he wound it." Miss Marple smiled kindly, though her thoughts quickened. Twice now Edmund had been seen at the clock, once before the murder and once after. Why should he concern himself so particularly with the mechanism, unless it were to ensure his earlier deception remained undetected? And why should he be cross, unless something about it troubled him? Later that afternoon, she visited Mr. Hargreaves herself, under the guise of inquiring after the churchyard roses. He confirmed what the boy had said. "Clock's been steady, as you please," he said, scratching his head. But Mr. Prowse insisted on checking it. Strange thing, for I never knew him to bother with such matters before. "The vicar, yes, or myself, but not Mr. Prowse." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully, her eyes resting on the old clock face against the pale sky. To her, the matter was plain. Edmund had sought to secure his alibi by shifting the time, yet now he hovered about the clock as though fearing discovery. It was the behavior of a man who had tampered with evidence and knew it. That evening, as she sat with her knitting, Miss Marple reflected on the turn events had taken. The threatening note had been a bold move, designed to cast suspicion further from Edmund and to deepen Clara's dependence upon him. But it was also a rash one, for such theatrics betrayed anxiety. Her truly innocent man would not need to frighten a girl into silence, nor would he risk the attention such a note inevitably brought. Edmund, in his effort to protect himself, had shown too much. Still, Miss Marple knew the time for revelation had not yet come. The inspector remained blind to the subtleties, fixed on his favoured suspects. Clara remained too cowed to speak freely, and Edmund, though rattled, still held his composure. But the cracks were widening. A note, a clock, a hand too firm on a frightened girl's arm. All these were signs that the mask was slipping. It would not be long before the guilty man betrayed himself utterly. For now Miss Marple contented herself with waiting, her needles clicking in steady rhythm, her eyes mild and unassuming. But behind them, her mind was clear and resolute. The web was tightening, and Edmund Prowse, though he did not yet know it, was already caught fast within it. "Would you like me to move forward into Section 8, Miss Marple's final test on 1,500 words, where she sets a quiet psychological snare to provoke Edmund into revealing himself?" The days shortened, and with the drawing in of the evenings the air of St. Aldith's grew heavier still. The note left for Clara had disturbed more than the girl herself. It had unsettled the whole village. In the grocer's shop, in the pews before service, in the very doorway of the cottages, voices dropped to whispers, and eyes flickered toward Clara and Edmund as they passed. To some, Edmund's resolute defense of the girl was noble, proof of loyalty. To others, his very eagerness to proclaim her innocence seemed too much, too rehearsed, like a man speaking for himself more than for another. Miss Marple, sitting with her knitting at her window as the afternoons faded into dusk, observed these little shifts with quiet attention. She had seen it all before, the guilty pressing too hard to appear steadfast, the frightened shrinking further into silence, the community dividing itself into camps of theory. But beyond the chatter and suspicion, her eyes were fixed steadily upon Edmund Prowse. He had made his error with the clock, he had betrayed himself with the note, and now his composure, though impressive, was stretched to breaking. It would not take much to unmask him. The question was how. Inspector Cray remained fixed in his certainty about Geoffrey and Clara. No amount of gentle suggestion would turn him from the obvious suspects. Miss Marple knew better than to argue. She also knew the futility of presenting mere theory. No, what was needed was something more subtle, a prod, a test, a chance for Edmund to reveal himself, not in words alone, but in that unmistakable flicker of human nature that could not be disguised. The opportunity came sooner than she might have expected. Mrs. Howard had proposed a small gathering at the vicarage, a supper, modest, intended to lift spirits and restore some semblance of ordinary life to the shaken community. Invitations were extended to those most closely touched by the events, and though some demurred, the evening found a dozen or so seated round the long table, their voices tentative at first, but softening with the warmth of candlelight and the comfort of food. Clara was there, wan but dutiful, her hand resting lightly upon Edmund's arm. Geoffrey was persuaded to attend as well, though his sulky silence betrayed his distaste. Inspector Cray and Constable Graves were present, at the vicar's urging, to show the law's friendly face in less formal circumstances. Miss Marple, seated near the middle of the table, allowed the conversation to flow about her. At first it clung to safe subjects, the harvest, the state of the lanes, the antics of the schoolchildren. But inevitably, it crept toward the subject that lay heavy upon every mind. Mrs. Ellison remarked upon the coroner's verdict with a shake of her head, and Mrs. Price Ridley, never one to hold her tongue, declared that it was high time the inspector made an arrest. Inspector Cray shifted uncomfortably, muttering something about patience and thoroughness. Geoffrey bristled, muttering under his breath about being hounded unjustly. Clara's eyes dropped to her plate, her hand tightening in Edmund's grasp. And Edmund, smoothly as ever, spoke up, his voice calm but firm. It is plain to any sensible person that Clara has suffered enough. The threats against her, the strain of suspicion, it is intolerable. The real culprit must be found, and swiftly. Found, and swiftly. Miss Marple looked at him over her spectacles, her needles paused in her lap. His words were measured, but his tone was just a little too polished, too certain, like a man speaking lines he had rehearsed. She waited, biding her time until a lull in the conversation allowed her to interject with her soft, unassuming voice. "It does make one wonder," she said gently, "about that curious business of the clock striking 6 instead of 4. I dare say most people thought little of it at the time, but it is very odd, is it not? Almost as though someone wished us to believe it later than it truly was." Her words fell lightly, but they drew a sudden stillness. Edmund's fork, halfway to his mouth, hung suspended for a fraction too long before he set it down carefully. The inspector frowned, dismissing the remark with a wave. "Old clocks play tricks often enough, Miss Marple. Nothing to be made of it." "Ah, but this one has always been so reliable," Miss Marple murmured. "Mr. Hargreaves takes such care of it. I remember it striking true all through last spring when the roof was being mended. Clocks, you know, do not change themselves. Someone must wind them wrong or interfere." There was a murmur at the table. Mrs. Ellison gasped softly. Mrs. Howard looked troubled. Geoffrey let out a derisive snort. Edmund's smile remained fixed, but his eyes flickered toward Clara with the briefest flash of warning. Miss Marple, who missed nothing, noted it with quiet satisfaction. She said no more for the moment, turning her attention back to her knitting. But the seed was sown. The inspector might not heed her observation, but Edmund had heard it, and in his silence she detected the first tremor of unease. He had prided himself on his composure, but composure was a brittle shield. It would take only one more touch to crack it. The evening wore on, and with the port and cheese came more relaxed conversation. It was then that Miss Marple made her second move. She spoke of other cases she had heard of in her long years, always couched as idle anecdotes. "I remember," she said mildly, "a case in another village not unlike this. A man was thought to have died at 1 hour, but it was later discovered the time had been altered, to make it seem so. It was very clever, but cleverness, I always think, is a dangerous thing. It so often trips one up." Her words were delivered with such simplicity that they might have been dismissed as the ramblings of an old lady. Yet across the table, Edmund's hand tightened visibly on his glass. Clara winced, her fingers twisting in her lap. Miss Marple, her eyes lowered to her knitting, allowed herself the faintest inward nod. The effect was working. When at last the company broke up and the guests drifted away into the night, Miss Marple walked home slowly beneath the stars, her thoughts calm but firm. She had seen the look in Edmund's eyes, the slight tremor in his voice as he bade her good evening. He was rattled, though he strove to hide it. And rattled men made mistakes. The following day she set her plan in motion. She called upon Clara, under the guise of bringing a jar of blackberry jam. Edmund was there, of course, hovering near the girl like a shadow. Miss Marple chatted amiably, spoke of the supper, of the autumn weather, of the roses that still bloomed in her garden. Then, with a gentle air of absent-mindedness, she remarked, "Such a pity about Mr. Trent's watch, to be broken like that and stopped so precisely. 20 minutes past 3, I think they said. So much neater than the parish clock, which struck 6 when it should have struck 4. She spoke the words lightly as though they were of no consequence. But Clara's eyes flew to Edmund's face, and Edmund himself stiffened almost imperceptibly. He recovered at once, of course, with a laugh that was just a shade too forced. "Really, Miss Marple, one would think you were playing detective yourself. Watches stop, clocks falter, there's nothing to it." Miss Marple only smiled, her expression mild. "Oh, perhaps. But one cannot help noticing little oddities, you know. They often mean more than people think. Well, I mustn't keep you. Do enjoy the jam, my dear. She left them then, but she knew her words had struck home. Edmund's mask was slipping. His careful control was fraying, and Clara's frightened glance had revealed the tension between them. It would not be long before the strain showed itself more plainly. That evening Miss Marple sat by her fire, her knitting laid aside, and considered the next step. The inspector would not act without something more solid. Clara would not speak while Edmund's shadow loomed over her. But Edmund himself, yes, he was the key. If he could be drawn into betraying himself, even with a slip of the tongue or a look too revealing, the inspector could no longer ignore it. Human nature, Miss Marple reflected, was a curious thing. The guilty might maintain their pretense under questioning, but place them in the presence of what they believe to be knowledge that threatens them, and they falter. That faltering was what she meant to provoke. The next day she arranged to meet Edmund by chance on the lane, her basket over her arm. She greeted him cheerfully, asked after Clara, and then, with her most innocent air, remarked, "It must be a great relief to you that the inspector has so little interest in that clock. One might think if he looked closer, he would find it very curious indeed." For the briefest moment Edmund's eyes blazed with alarm. He recovered almost instantly, offering her a smile that was meant to be indulgent, but his voice was tight. "You do have a lively imagination, Miss Marple. I'd advise you not to trouble yourself with such matters. Leave them to the authorities." She inclined her head, smiling sweetly. "Oh, of course. Only one can't help noticing. Such a habit, I'm afraid. Good day to you, Mr. Prowse." As she walked away, she knew the test had succeeded. Edmund had betrayed himself, not in words that could be written down, but in that involuntary flicker of fear. He was crumbling piece by piece, and soon he would collapse altogether. Would you like me to move into Section 9, the reveal, 1,500 words, where Miss Marple gently but decisively exposes Edmund before the inspector and the villagers, drawing together every clue into one undeniable conclusion? The morning after her carefully placed remark on the lane, Miss Marple rose earlier than usual. She moved about her cottage with her customary quiet order, boiling water for her tea, tending to the canary, laying her knitting ready by the armchair. To anyone passing her window, she would appear much as she always did, the embodiment of harmless domesticity. Yet beneath that mild exterior, her thoughts were sharp and decisive. She knew the moment had come to act, for Edmund Prowse was unravelling. His mask of composure was no longer whole. Cracks showed in his manner, in the sudden sharpness of his voice, in the fear that had flickered in his eyes when she had mentioned the clock. A man who had committed murder might sustain pretense for a while, but guilt gnawed at the edges, and when once it began to show, it spread swiftly. The village remained restless, every conversation still turning on the murder. Mrs. Ellison had taken to declaring that the inspector ought to make his arrest at once, for the peace of the community, if nothing else. Mrs. Price Ridley maintained that Clara was guilty, while Miss Hartnell continued to press her view that Geoffrey's temper condemned him. Inspector Cray, though weary, leaned toward Geoffrey as the likelier suspect, for his alibi remained imperfect and his quarrel with his uncle plain. But Miss Marple knew better. Human nature, in her long experience, seldom misled her, and it told her plainly that Geoffrey's anger was bluster. Clara's terror was helplessness, and Edmund's calm was calculation. She decided, therefore, to set matters in motion herself. The inspector would not act without cause, so she must provide him with cause. Not evidence of the forensic kind. She never placed much stock in that, but a demonstration, a moment in which Edmund betrayed himself so clearly that even the most unimaginative mind could not deny it. She had seen it before in other places, with other people, the guilty brought to confession by their own weakness when the right word or circumstance pressed them. That afternoon, she walked to the vicarage, where she found Mrs. Howard in some agitation over the state of the parish. With her gentle manner, Miss Marple steered the conversation to the question of whether the inspector might be persuaded to gather those chiefly concerned for a final review of the facts. "It is often helpful," she said softly, "to let people hear the whole thing plainly set out in order. Sometimes in the hearing of it, truth declares itself." Mrs. Howard, who admired Miss Marple's good sense, readily agreed, and so it was arranged that on the following evening Inspector Cray would call a meeting in the vicarage drawing-room. Geoffrey, Clara, Edmund, Dr. Pendleton, Constable Graves, and a few of the more prominent villagers were summoned. To the inspector, it was presented as an opportunity to review the case with the community. To Miss Marple, it was the stage upon which she meant to let Edmund betray himself. The next evening, the drawing-room was crowded, the lamps burning brightly, the air thick with the scent of polished wood, and the murmur of uneasy voices. Inspector Cray opened the proceedings with a brisk summary of the facts. Mr. Trent's death by a blow to the back of the head, the candlestick found in the orchard, the quarrel with Geoffrey, the debt pressing upon Clara's family. He spoke with the gravity of a man accustomed to laying out his case before a jury, though his audience was but a handful of anxious villagers. Geoffrey shifted restlessly in his chair, his jaw set. Clara sat pale and silent beside her mother, with Edmund close at her side. His hand rested lightly on hers, the picture of support, though Miss Marple noted how Clara flinched almost imperceptibly at his touch. Miss Marple herself sat near the fire, her knitting in her lap, her head bowed as though she were merely an elderly listener. When the inspector had finished, he looked round the room. That is where the matter stands. The verdict is open, but the evidence points strongly, in my judgment, toward one of two suspects, Mr. Geoffrey Trent, who quarrelled bitterly with the deceased, or Miss Clara Barnes, who had cause to fear his demands. Either motive coupled with opportunity might suffice. A murmur went round the room. Geoffrey burst out with an oath, protesting his innocence. Clara gave a soft cry, hiding her face in her hands. Edmund spoke firmly, his voice carrying, "It is monstrous that Clara should be accused again. She has suffered enough. I tell you, Inspector, the true culprit lies elsewhere." At that, Miss Marple lifted her head and spoke in her gentle, apologetic way. "If I might be permitted, Inspector, I am an old woman and may see things differently, but I cannot help thinking that the answer does not lie with either poor Clara or young Geoffrey." There was a stir at this. The inspector frowned, but Miss Marple continued quietly, her eyes moving from face to face. "It is a curious thing, is it not, that the parish clock struck 6 instead of 4 at the very moment Clara found the body?" Now, most people laughed it off as a mistake. But clocks do not strike the wrong hour of their own accord. They must be set so. And Mr. Hargreaves assures me he wound it as usual the day before, so there was no reason for it to err. That means someone interfered. Her words fell into the silence like stones into a pond. Edmund's fingers, resting on Clara's hand, stiffened visibly. Miss Marple went on, still mild, almost as though she spoke of nothing remarkable. And why would anyone do such a thing? Only, I think, to confuse the time. You see, Mr. Trent's watch was broken, stopped at 20 minutes past 3. But the clock told us it was nearer 6. If we believe the clock, then certain people's alibis appear stronger than they are. If we believe the watch, then matters are quite different. It was very clever, yes, but cleverness often proves dangerous to the one who employs it. There was a pause. The inspector shifted uneasily, and Constable Graves scratched his head. Geoffrey muttered something about trickery, while Clara looked up suddenly, her eyes wide, darting to Edmund's face. Miss Marple's gaze, calm and steady, rested upon Edmund himself. "You were seen at the clock, Mr. Prowse," she said softly, "by little Jimmy Ellison, the day before the murder, and again by the sexton afterwards. You said it was to tend the mechanism, but it had never needed such attention before. I dare say you thought no one would notice. But children often notice what their elders overlook." Edmund's composure wavered. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came. His smile flickered, then faltered. Clara gave a small cry, pulling her hand from his grasp. Miss Marple's voice remained gentle but firm. "Mr. Trent pressed you for repayment, did he not? It is written in his ledger. Your affairs were not so prosperous as you wished others to believe. If he had his way, your ruin would be plain before the village, and Clara would learn that her suitor was not the protector she thought, but a man drowning in debt. You could not permit that, so you silenced him. The candlestick from his own house was at hand, and the orchard was near enough. And when the deed was done, you altered the clock, so that suspicion would fall elsewhere. The silence that followed was absolute. Even the fire in the grate seemed to burn more softly. Edmund's face, pale now, twisted with anger and fear. "This is nonsense," he spat suddenly. "Idle fancy, the rambling of an old woman. You have no proof. Miss Marple's eyes did not waver. Proof perhaps not in the way the inspector would like, but truth has a way of declaring itself. You betrayed yourself, Mr. Prowse, when you sought to frighten Clara into silence with that note. The handwriting was disguised, yes, but not enough. It bore the same angular habit I have seen in your business letters at the post office. And Clara's terror whenever she is near you speaks plainly enough. You have pressed her, not only with your attentions but with your hold over her family's plight. That is why she trembles, not from guilt but from fear. Clara gave a sob, hiding her face, and Edmund sprang to his feet, his composure gone. "She's lying," he cried, though it was plain to all that Miss Marple had not lied at all. His voice shook, his hand clenched at his side, and in that moment the calm, assured gentleman of the village vanished. What remained was a man cornered, his mask torn away, his guilt written plainly on his face. The inspector rose, his expression hard. "That will do, Mr. Prowse. I think we've heard enough." But Miss Marple spoke once more, her tone softer now, almost pitying. "It is always the little things, you see. A clock that strikes at the wrong hour, a watch stopped at the moment of death, a child's passing remark. They are so easily overlooked, yet they betray the truth. Human nature is much the same. You may act with calculation, but the smallest gesture, the smallest glance will reveal you. You could not help it, Mr. Prowse. That is why you are caught." Edmund sank back into his chair, his head in his hands. Clara sobbed openly, her mother enfolding her in her arms. The room was hushed, the villagers staring in shock, until Inspector Cray at last gave the order for Edmund to be taken into custody. Constable Graves stepped forward, laying a heavy hand on Edmund's shoulder. As the company slowly dispersed, still murmuring, Miss Marple remained by the fire, her knitting once more in her lap. She did not look triumphant, only sad, for though justice was necessary, it was never a happy thing. She thought of Clara, freed but scarred by the ordeal, of Geoffrey, hot-headed but innocent, of the village itself, which would never again look at Edmund Prowse without remembering this night. And she thought, as she always did, of the frailty of human nature, which in its weakness so often bred cruelty. When at last she walked home beneath the starlit sky, she felt the cool air upon her face and listened to the hush of the village settling once more. St. Aldith's would return to its routines, its small comforts and quarrels, but a shadow had passed over it that would not easily be forgotten. And at her garden gate, Miss Marple paused, murmuring softly to herself, "The clock that struck at the wrong hour." Yes, it told us all we needed to know. Would you like me to continue into Section 10, Aftermath, 1500 words, where the village absorbs the revelation? Clara finds release from Edmund's control, and Miss Marple reflects quietly on the nature of human weakness and the inevitability of truth. Followed Edmund Prowse's arrest, passed with a curious mixture of relief and unease. For the first time since the murder, the villagers felt a measure of safety, for the guilty man was removed from among them. Yet the revelation that Edmund, so polished and self-assured, had been the culprit unsettled many. People looked at one another with new eyes, as though doubting their own ability to judge character. "If Mr. Prowse could be guilty," Mrs. Ellison said more than once, "then who among us may not be hiding something?" It was a sentiment repeated across St. Aldith's, for the crime had struck too near home to be dismissed easily. Clara, released from Edmund's grip, passed through days of shock and quiet weeping. Freed from suspicion, she seemed a different girl, though pale and subdued, like someone recovering from an illness. Her gratitude toward Miss Marple was shy and heartfelt, expressed in little more than a whispered word and a timid handclasp. Miss Marple accepted it with her usual gentleness, never seeking thanks, knowing that true healing would take time. Clara's mother, once cowed by fear of scandal, now busied herself with practical matters, determined to restore her household's dignity after the shadow that had hung over it. Geoffrey Trent, though relieved to be cleared, did not emerge unscathed. His temper and imprudence had made him too easy a target for suspicion, and though innocent of the murder, his reputation bore the stain of the weeks of doubt. In time, perhaps, he might prove steadier, but Miss Marple, observing him from afar, suspected he would always be a man inclined to bluster rather than reflection. It was, she thought, his nature, and human nature rarely changed at its core. The inspector, for his part, was chastened, though too proud to admit it openly. He had pursued the obvious suspects, blind to the subtle clues that told the true story. Afterward, he offered Miss Marple a stiff word of thanks, though it was clear he regarded her methods with suspicion. She accepted it with a serene smile, as she always did. She asked for no recognition, content that justice had been done. The village slowly settled back into its routines. The parish clock, tended once more by Mr. Hargreaves, struck its hours, with dependable precision, and each toll reminded the villagers of the strange trick it had once played, a trick that had very nearly allowed a murderer to walk free. The orchard, for a time avoided, was eventually returned to its peaceful use, the children darting among its trees once more. Yet whenever a shadow passed there, or the leaves rustled suddenly in the wind, more than one villager shivered, recalling the sight of Mr. Trent's body beneath the branches. As for Miss Marple, she resumed her quiet life. Visitors called at her cottage, some with small gifts, others with lingering questions about the case. She received them all kindly, though she never offered more than a gentle observation. To those who pressed, she would only say, "It was not so very complicated, you know. People reveal themselves in the smallest ways. One must only watch and listen." And then she would pour another cup of tea or return to her knitting, as though nothing remarkable had occurred at all. One evening, as she sat by her fire with her needles clicking in steady rhythm, she reflected on it once more. Edmund's downfall had been his cleverness, his belief that by controlling appearances, by tampering with a clock, by pressing Clara into silence, by disguising a note, he could master events. But cleverness, Miss Marple knew, was always a dangerous tool. Human nature, in its simplest truths, had betrayed him. The flicker of fear in his eyes, the too tight grasp of his hand, the vanity that led him to think no one would notice a clock striking the wrong hour. These were the real proofs, stronger than any physical evidence, for human nature was always consistent, and in it lay the solution to every puzzle. She looked about her cozy sitting room, the lamplight falling softly upon the familiar furniture, the roses faintly visible through the window in the moonlight. St. Aldith's was at peace again, though changed, as all villages are when touched by violence. In time, gossip would turn back to harvests and marriages, to weather and trifles. The shadow would fade, though never quite vanish, for memory clings long in such places. Miss Marple, content in her solitude, allowed herself a small, thoughtful smile. Evil, she knew, was not a thing of grand gestures, but of ordinary weaknesses, of pride, greed, fear. It appeared even in quiet villages, among people who smiled politely and spoke kindly. And it was her work, as long as she had breath, to see it when others did not, to unravel the threads others ignored. The clock in the church tower struck the hour, clear and true, each note falling in perfect sequence. Miss Marple listened to it with quiet satisfaction. The wrong hour had been set right, justice had been served, and life in all its ordinary and extraordinary ways would go on. She bent her head once more to her knitting, her needles flashing in the lamplight, her thoughts already drifting toward the next little mystery that life in St. Aldith's would surely bring, and so the village slept. The roses nodded in the night air, and the woman who had seen into the very heart of human nature sat serenely at her hearth, reflecting, as she so often did, that people, in their kindnesses and their cruelties, were always the same. The clock had struck at the wrong hour, but in the end truth had struck precisely when it must.